Hi, my name is AAmato, and I'm a senior at Fluvanna County High School. I'm very excited to share with you my project on race relations. So, as we know, racism is a very controversial topic that can leave people feeling anxious, upset, or even angry, which is why before we start, I think it's important that we keep a couple things in mind. And to share those things, I'm going to use an analogy. So, imagine if you're driving your car and all of a sudden she starts smoking and all the lights turn on. Well, unless you know how to fix a car and you know stuff about cars, then you won't be able to fix it. And the same can be said for having educated discussions on racism. If you don't know a lot about the topic and you don't have factual information to back yourself, then you can't fight for it. To continue with the analogy, say you finally take your car to the mechanic and he's working on it. Well, the first thing he's going to do, or she, is going to look for the root cause. And just like that mechanic will look for the root cause, when we're discussing race relations, we have to look at the root problem. What's actually causing these inequalities, and how can we best address that? And this leads to say, throughout this presentation and all your other interactions with race relations, I'd like to encourage you to take a stance of non-judgmental listening. Because each and every one of us has our own different and individualized and unique perspectives. And I think we can bridge a lot of gaps if we just listen and acknowledge that maybe this person's perspective isn't the same, but it doesn't mean that it's any less right. Now, this leads me to my topic and why I chose it. So, as I've stated before, my topic is racism. And why I chose this, I'd like to place the blame on Mr. Morrison's AP US history class. First, it was slavery, and then it was the Dred Scott case, and then it was the New York City draft riots, and then the KKK, and then Plessy versus Ferguson, that legalized segregation. Over and over in history, we kept learning about these horrible atrocities that had been committed against African Americans just because of their race. And every single time I'd ask Mr. Morrison, why would people do that? I just don't understand. And the reason was because I can't understand. You see, this is a white picket fence, and this represents the boundary between me here and the real world. See, I'm white, upper middle class, Catholic teenager who lives in a rural county in Virginia. My perspective is very limited. And even though I hear about racism all the time, and you see it on the news and you read about it, and you know it exists, but I just couldn't understand it because they've been so sheltered from it. So with this project, it led to me trying to say, okay, how can I step out of this boundary and how can I solve a problem? Which led me to my essential question: how can we use the history of race relations to solve the current racial crisis? And using research from lots of articles, journals, documents, videos, and images, I was able to find a lot of information. But the first thing that I had to do was understand, what is race? And what I found was that race isn't even real. I mean, the effects of it exist, but race is just a social construct made to ensure political and economic domination of one group over another. But this definition didn't just happen overnight. It took thousands of years to evolve. And based on what I've read in my research and what I personally believe, it stemmed from fear and a need for dominance. So, to touch up on this fear issue, compared to the Europeans and the Asians and the indigenous people and Africans and all the other ethnic groups across the world, everybody was so different. They spoke different languages, they dressed differently, their religions were different, they appeared to be different than you, and they talked different. Everything seemed to be different. And because it was, people were afraid. This is just like me with roller coasters. I see this giant roller coaster. I'm like, that's not normal. That's scary. So instead of trying to try it out, no, I won't do that. And so just like I won't try roller coasters or even give them a chance because I'm afraid of it, people were afraid to interact with people that look different than them. And the other reason that I believe this definition of race developed was because of the desire for domination. Whether you believe in Golding's idea that all human beings are created equal, or if you think they're just neutral, since the beginning of mankind, since people have been afraid of each other, well, they've also been fighting each other. Wars have spanned out through the centuries, and it's mainly stemmed from yes, I'm afraid of you. And because of that, people feel like they need to control someone else, because if you control them, then you don't have to be afraid anymore, because you can take away their culture, you can take away their beliefs and religions and languages and force them to be something you want. And so, with those two things in mind, slavery developed. And slavery is not unique to America. It existed in almost every civilization before so. And the word slave actually comes from the word Slavic, because the first mass slavery was of the Slavic people in the Middle East. But how American slavery was so different from the rest of the world was that it was so industrialized. For the first time ever, slavery was on such a wide scale that it was like the factory system in the North, but the slave system in the South. And so that developed in this horrible monster that totally divided the races. But fortunately, slavery did end in both the world and America. And even though it ended in America due to the Civil War, it gave us Reconstruction. And I pictured Reconstruction here with with an African American man getting beat up, because this shows just how awful Reconstruction actually turned out. If you think about it, the Civil War ended, right? And for the first time, we have the ability to rebuild race relations. But what did we do with that? Well, at first, it was successful. African Americans were given the right to vote and citizenship and due process and their natural rights. But then, with the Compromise of 1877, that put the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in office in exchange for removing the troops from the South, Reconstruction ended. And due to the failure to implement lasting policies in the South during Reconstruction, the present racial tensions have resulted. And I think the best example of this, at least for me, because I love education, is with educational inequalities. So this is a picture of the Freedmen's Bureau. It's pretty famous, and you can see that they're teaching African American kids how to read and write. Well, the Freedmen's Bureau was great, and it did a lot of things for African Americans. But the thing was, when Reconstruction ended, so did that movement for education. And most of the African Americans were retrapped into the slavery system, but under tenant farming and other things like apprenticeships and that were really bad contracts. And so, because they didn't have the money to go to school, well, they couldn't send their kids to school. And then they also needed their kids to help work with them. So their kids didn't get any education. And if you don't have education, you're unfortunately stuck in a certain occupation, because education allows you to improve your career. But because they weren't allowed to get that, they were stuck in this self-deprecating cycle of poverty, which has continued today. And African Americans were denied the right of education for so long. They were told they weren't smart enough, they weren't good enough, and that leaves a lasting impact. So when schools finally were desegregated, of course there was violence from the white supremacy resistance, but there was also that feeling that maybe I'm not good enough. And so this educational inequality today has resulted in lower test scores of African American students than white students, which you can see on this graph. And although this may not seem like a significant thing, it is. Because if you don't have education, you can't improve yourself. And so you can tell by this the obvious shortcomings of Reconstruction to help this. Now, while my research was definitely successful, obtaining an internship was not as much. It was a lot harder than I thought it would be. But eventually, I was fortunate enough to get an internship with Mr. Overton McGee at the Fluvanna County Historical Society in July of 2021. So last year, his daughter, a Fluvanna County High School and Georgetown University graduate, started studying the interactions of African Americans in Fluvanna County. And she went through all the census information from 1880 to 1910 and found that by 1910, 70% of African Americans own land. And to us, that may be like, that's not that important. But at that time, and especially in a rural Southern community, that was a big deal. That number was an anomaly. And so their question was, well, how did owning land allow African Americans to have more civil liberties? And with that in mind, they tasked me with tracking the land ownership of African Americans, and I got to look through all these lovely record books and read fairly legible handwriting. And it was actually quite interesting because you're reading this transaction and you just have to think about this happened at a totally different time in a totally different place. Look at how much progress we've made, but at the same time, look at how many ways that we're the same. Well, while I enjoyed my internship, my community service did not have the same amount of success. My original plan was to work with Mr. David Small, the SGA and TV production teacher at Fluvanna County High School, to make a video series on race relations. But unfortunately, I had some health problems that have left me out of school for a long time, and as you can see, I'm still out of school. However, what I've also learned is that I can still find new ways to make things work. And so I decided to make a video about why understanding race is important and how that can help us create a better world. In addition to learning this, I've learned that I have to have humility, and all of us do. Because even though I've learned a lot, there's so much that I still don't know. And there's so many ways that my perspective still influences me. But I learned that I can take my perspective and, you know, check that and make sure I'm not prejudiced and biased. And I also learned that the most powerful thing is to learn from other people's stories. Because, like I said before, everyone has unique perspectives, and the ability to learn from that and to be moved by that is really what can help us have progress. What I also learned is that I have to set my own boundaries. This is how I felt for a lot of the senior project, as most of you seniors that have completed it can agree with. It's overwhelming. And one of the reasons why it was overwhelming for me was because for so long I said yes to everything. And I wanted to do everything. But what I realize now is that just because you can do everything doesn't mean that's what's best for you. A lot of times I chased doing something because I wanted to have, look the best or be really successful or do the most. But what I realized is just because I can doesn't mean that that's what will help me in the long run. And what's really the most important is that I am doing the best that I can do at that given moment. And if the best that I can do right now is give my Blue Ridge Senior presentation from home, then that's what I'll do. And I'll be happy with it. Well, I am very excited to next year continue my education at either the University of South Carolina Honors College, the University of Virginia, or the James Monroe program at William & Mary. I don't know where I'm going to go yet, but I do know that I'm going to study education. I want to be a high school language arts teacher, and I'm also going to major in Spanish so I can help the kids that are English as a second language. In addition to this, it's really important for me to continue my study with educational inequality so I can make sure that as a teacher, I help every student have equal opportunities to succeed. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. This is something I drew, and I love to draw, and it's a big part of me, so which is why I'm deciding to include it. But thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know.